In 2019, geneticists published DNA analysis from 44 populations across sub-Saharan Africa. The study examined how different groups are related and how their populations changed over time. One pattern stood out immediately. Across huge areas of the continent, populations carrying ancestry linked to some of Africa's oldest hunter-gatherer societies had dramatically declined over the last 2,000 years. Among them were the peoples of southern Africa, who speak the distinctive click languages, often grouped together as Khoisan. These communities represent one of the oldest continuous human lineages on Earth. Archaeological and genetic evidence suggests their ancestors have lived in southern Africa for tens of thousands of years. Yet, between roughly 500 BCE and 1500 CE, the demographic balance across much of sub-Saharan Africa changed profoundly. Not because of a single war, not because of a sudden disease, but because of something slower. When researchers compared archaeological evidence, languages, and genetic data, they found the same pattern repeating across nearly 10 million square kilometers, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Indian Ocean, from the Sahel to the southern tip of Africa, between about 1000 BCE and 1500 CE, communities speaking early Bantu languages gradually spread across most of Central, Eastern, and Southern Africa. They did not form a single empire. There was no central army, no coordinated campaign. Instead, thousands of small communities moved outward over generations, sometimes integrating with the societies already living there, sometimes pushing them into ecological margins, often mixing with them. Over centuries, these local shifts accumulated into one of the largest human population expansions in history. And because it unfolded slowly, across dozens of generations, no single generation ever experienced it as a single event. But in the end, the transformation reshaped the human geography of an entire continent. 3,000 years ago, sub-Saharan Africa was already home to many different societies. In southern Africa lived communities now broadly referred to as Khoisan peoples. They spoke languages built around distinctive click consonants. Their rock art, found across thousands of sites, records hunting scenes, cosmological imagery, and complex symbolic traditions. These were not simple societies. They were highly specialized hunter-gatherer systems, adapted to specific landscapes. Hunter-gatherer economies typically support relatively low population densities, often between roughly 1/10 and half a person per square kilometer, depending on the ecosystem. But low density does not mean instability. Many such systems remain sustainable for thousands of years. Farther north, in the forests of the Congo Basin, lived other hunter-gatherer societies. Groups such as the Mbuti and the Aka, communities with extremely detailed ecological knowledge of rainforest environments. Which vines hold drinkable water? Which plants treat illness? How animal movements change with rainfall? Knowledge like that accumulates over many generations. Across Eastern Africa, pastoralist societies raised cattle and moved seasonally with grazing cycles. These were not static cultures. They were adaptive systems matched to particular environments. Then, around 1000 BCE, another system began to expand. In the region near what is now Cameroon and Nigeria, communities speaking early Bantu languages combined two powerful technologies: ironworking and tropical agriculture. Archaeological evidence shows iron smelting appearing in this region between roughly 1000 and 500 BCE. Iron tools, axes, and hoes allowed forests to be cleared far more efficiently than stone tools. At the same time, crops such as yams could produce high caloric yields in tropical environments. The combination changed how much food a landscape could support. A territory that might sustain a few hunter-gatherer families could support many more farming households. Not a small difference, sometimes an order of magnitude increase in population density. When two systems rely on the same land, but support very different numbers of people, the balance between them eventually shifts. And once a growing population encounters that difference, expansion often follows. The process did not begin with a mass migration. It began with villages. A farming settlement grows. Food production increases. More children survive into adulthood. Within several generations, the surrounding land can no longer support the expanding population. Part of the community moves. Perhaps 50 kilometers away, perhaps 100, they clear new land, plant crops, build new villages, and the process repeats. Anthropologists sometimes describe this pattern as demographic fission. Communities divide and expand outward over generations. Evidence for this process appears clearly in language patterns. Today, there are more than 500 Bantu languages. At first glance, that looks like extraordinary diversity. But linguistically, they are closely related, which means they all descended from a common ancestral language spoken thousands of years ago. When communities split and remain separated for centuries, their languages gradually diverge. Pronunciations change, new words appear, grammar shifts. After a few hundred years, the languages may no longer be mutually intelligible. The sheer number of Bantu languages therefore reflects thousands of local separations over time. A branching pattern created by communities spreading across the landscape for more than 2 millennia. Archaeological and linguistic evidence suggests 3 major routes of expansion. One through the forests of the Congo Basin, another through the Great Lakes region of East Africa, and a southern movement into the savannas of southern Africa. None of these movements were centrally directed. They were the accumulated result of thousands of small decisions by farming communities responding to local pressures. By around 300 CE, Bantu-speaking societies had reached parts of southern Africa. By 1500 CE, they occupied much of Central, Eastern, and Southern Africa. A transformation that unfolded over roughly 25 centuries. As these farming communities expanded, they encountered societies already living in those regions. The outcomes varied widely. In some areas, there was integration. In others, displacement into less agriculturally suitable regions. And in many cases, long-term exchange relationships developed. In the forests of Central Africa, for example, farming communities often relied on local hunter-gatherer groups for ecological knowledge. Which plants were edible, where animals migrated, how to navigate dense rainforest environments. These exchanges created trade relationships. Forest specialists provided knowledge and forest products. Farming communities provided iron tools and cultivated food. Over time, however, cultural shifts occurred. Many forest hunter-gatherer groups gradually adopted Bantu languages through prolonged contact. Their older languages either disappeared or survive today, only in fragments and linguistic traces. In southern Africa, the pattern unfolded differently. For centuries, farming communities and Khoisan hunter-gatherers lived in adjacent ecological zones. Farmers tended to occupy wetter regions suitable for crops. Hunter-gatherers remained in drier landscapes where agriculture was less productive. Over long periods, however, the demographic advantage of farming systems gradually altered the balance. Agricultural populations tend to grow more quickly than hunter-gatherer populations when food production increases. Across centuries, that difference shifts settlement patterns across entire regions. By the late medieval period, many Khoisan communities were concentrated in areas such as the Kalahari and parts of the Cape region. Later historical events, including European colonization, beginning in the 17th century, added further pressures. That reshaped these societies again. Today, only a small number of Khoisan languages remain widely spoken. And many of the rock art traditions created by their ancestors are difficult to interpret fully because the cultural contexts that produced them have changed or disappeared. Why did the expansion continue for so long? Part of the answer lies in the structure of agricultural societies themselves. Food production allows populations to grow gradually over generations. When a community expands beyond the land immediately available to it, some members often establish new settlements nearby. Those settlements eventually repeat the same process. Over centuries, this creates outward waves of settlement. There are also cultural reasons expansion becomes difficult to reverse. Agricultural systems depend on specific skills, crop cultivation, food storage, tool production. Once a society has specialized in those systems for generations, returning to a completely different subsistence strategy becomes difficult. Communities, therefore, adapt their farming practices instead. Different crops appear in different climates, sorghum and millet in drier regions, root crops in wetter environments. Livestock strategies change as well. Cattle, where grazing is possible. goats where conditions are harsher. These adjustments allowed Bantu-speaking societies to move through diverse environments across the continent. Not because every new landscape was ideal, but because populations continued to grow and adapt. When historians describe the Bantu expansion, they often call it a migration. And in many ways it was. But it was also something broader. A long-term interaction between technology, food production, and population growth. When one subsistence system supports significantly higher population densities than another, the balance between them gradually shifts, not instantly, but over generations. The Bantu expansion lasted more than 2,000 years, long enough that no single generation saw the entire transformation. Yet by the end of that period, the linguistic and cultural landscape of much of Africa had changed dramatically. Hundreds of related languages spread across a vast region. New agricultural societies appeared in places where other subsistence systems once dominated, and older traditions survived in new forms, sometimes merged with those that arrived later. Seen from a distance, the Bantu expansion reveals a broader pattern in human history. Technologies that increase food production often reshape where people live. And over long periods of time, those changes can transform entire continents. The Bantu expansion was not a single event. It was thousands of small movements, repeated for centuries. Until eventually, the map of Africa looked very different. From the one that existed before it began.